The hound's insistence. The morning clung to Jebediah like a damp shroud. Mist snaked between the skeletal branches of the trees, chilling him despite the thick wool of his coat. Another day, another hunt. He shifted the weight of his rifle, the familiar heft a small comfort in the vast indifference of the woods. He'd been alone so long, the silence had become a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. Sometimes, in the evenings, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced, he'd catch himself talking aloud just to hear the sound of a human voice, even if it was only his own. It wasn't a good habit. Dusty, his blue-tick hound, trotted ahead, nose to the ground, a symphony of snuffles and snorts the only other sound in the pre-dawn stillness. Jebediah relied on Dusty. More than he cared to admit, perhaps. The dog was his eyes and ears, his confidant in a world that offered little companionship. Today he was hunting deer. The venison would last him through the coming weeks, supplementing the dwindling supply of dried beans and salted pork in his cabin. He needed to make it count. But Dusty seemed to have other ideas. Instead of sticking to the well-worn game trail, the dog veered sharply to the left, plunging into a thicket of thorny bushes and tangled vines. "Dusty, where you goin', you fool mutt?" Jebediah called out, his voice a low growl. The dog ignored him, a low whine escaping his throat, his tail wagging with frantic energy. He pushed deeper into the undergrowth, disappearing from view. Jebediah sighed, a plume of white vapor puffing out in the cold air. He didn't have time for this. Every wasted minute increased the chances of spooking the deer, leaving him empty-handed. "Dusty," he shouted again, louder this time. The only response was a series of insistent barks, sharp and urgent, emanating from the heart of the thicket. It wasn't the bark Dusty used for squirrels or rabbits. This was different. This was important. Cursing under his breath, Jebediah pushed his way through the thorny barrier. The branches snagged at his coat, tearing at the fabric, leaving angry red scratches on his skin. The air grew heavy, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. He emerged into a small clearing, barely large enough for a man to stand in. Dusty was there, pacing back and forth, his tail still wagging, but his body tense, alert. He kept nudging his nose at something hidden behind a cluster of ferns. "What is it, boy? You find a bear cub?" Jebediah asked, his hand instinctively tightening on his rifle. Dusty let out another bark, a short, sharp command. He didn't usually act this way. Usually he obeyed Jebediah's commands with unwavering loyalty. His insistence was unsettling. Jebediah cautiously approached the ferns, his senses on high alert. He could hear the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under his boots. The air felt different here, colder, heavier. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, green fronds. With a quick tug, he pulled them aside. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a bear cub. It was a wagon. Or rather, the remnants of one. A shattered wheel lay half buried in the mud, its spokes broken and splintered. The canvas cover was ripped to shreds, hanging limply from the wooden frame like tattered flags. The air reeked of rot and decay. Jebediah had seen plenty of abandoned wagons in his time. Settlers, lured west by promises of cheap land and easy riches, often found themselves unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. Their dreams, like their wagons, were often left to rot in the wilderness. But there was something different about this wagon. Something that made the hair on the back of Jebediah's neck stand on end. It wasn't just the age of it or the extent of the damage. It was a feeling, a sense of wrongness that permeated the air. Dusty whined, nudging Jebediah's hand with his wet nose. He looked up at him, his brown eyes filled with an unnerving intensity. Jebediah swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the wreckage before him. He didn't know what had happened here, but he knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary abandoned wagon. And Dusty, for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, was determined to show it to him. He ran a hand over the cold steel of his rifle. The hunt was forgotten. Something else, something far more unsettling, had begun. A broken wagon, a broken dream. The wagon lay on its side, a skeletal beast picked clean by time and scavengers. One wheel was completely gone, the axle splintered and gouged. Canvas, ripped and faded, flapped like a tattered flag in the breeze. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Dusty whined, his tail tucked low, circling the wreck with hesitant steps. Jebediah ran a hand over the rough wood of the wagon bed. "Looks like she's been here a while, boy." He rounded the back of the wagon and his breath hitched. A woman lay sprawled amidst the scattered debris. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, was now stained with mud and torn at the seams. A tangle of auburn hair obscured her face. He knelt beside her, his calloused fingers reaching out to check for a pulse at her throat. Faint, but there. Dusty nudged her hand with his wet nose, whimpering softly. Jebediah gently brushed the hair from her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and bruised around her temples. She was young, barely more than a girl. Clutched tightly in her hand was a small, tarnished silver frame. He carefully pried it loose. Inside, a photograph. A woman, younger, brighter, smiled back at him. A church steeple rose in the background, and there was a sense of prosperity and hope in the woman's eyes. He glanced from the photograph to the unconscious woman. The resemblance was undeniable, though the brightness in the photo had been replaced by shadows in the present. He stood, lifting her carefully in his arms. She was light, too light. "We got to get her back to the cabin, Dusty. And quick." The journey back was slow and arduous. The woman remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow. Jebediah focused on placing one foot in front of the other, ignoring the burning in his arms and the ache in his back. Dusty trotted faithfully beside him, occasionally glancing up at the woman in his arms, a low growl rumbling in his chest whenever a shadow moved too quickly. Back at the cabin, Jebediah laid her gently on his bed, the only soft surface he owned. He stoked the fire, adding fresh logs until the room was bathed in a warm, golden glow. He heated water in a pot over the flames, then used a damp cloth to clean the dirt and grime from her face. As he cleaned a cut on her forehead, her eyes fluttered open. She stared up at him, her gaze unfocused and filled with fear. "Easy now," Jebediah said, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe. You're at my cabin." She blinked, trying to focus. "Wagon," she whispered, her voice raspy. The men, "Hush now. Rest. You're safe here." He wrung out the cloth and gently dabbed at her forehead again. She closed her eyes, her breathing evening out slightly. Jebediah watched her, his brow furrowed. Who were these men? And what had happened to her? He picked up the photograph again, studying the woman's face. There was a strength there, a quiet determination that mirrored something he saw in himself. He tucked the photograph into his pocket. He had a feeling it held the key to understanding who this woman was and what had brought her to his doorstep. Dusty nudged his hand, his big brown eyes filled with concern. Jebediah scratched him behind the ears. "She'll be all right, boy. We'll take care of her." He wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. He hadn't taken care of anyone in a long time. The thought felt foreign, yet not unwelcome. He pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for the night. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He watched the woman sleep, a silent vigil over a stranger whose fate had become inexplicably intertwined with his own. Shelter and solace. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air thickening with her presence. Every creak and pop of the fire acquired a sharp resonance. Jebediah lowered her onto his bunk, the homespun smelling of kindling and the sharp bite of wintergreen. Even streaked with grime, a fragile serenity graced her sleeping features. The photograph's phantom lingered in his thoughts, a similar loveliness, yes, but this woman bore the palpable weight of hard-won survival etched around her eyes, even in repose. First, the blood. He soaked a cloth in well water, icy to the touch, and began to tend to the abrasions on her forehead and arms. Superficial, thank God, more scrapes than lacerations. The gash marring her side gave him pause. It gaped, a festering crimson, already hinting at infection. Cauterization was the only answer. He delved into his sparse apothecary, unearthing a scant pouch of dried yarrow. Pulverizing the leaves, he combined them with rendered bear fat, fashioning a salve intended to leach out the venom. His movements, though deliberate, held a surprising tenderness for a man so weathered. He cleansed the wound with whiskey, the good stuff, usually reserved for the bone-chilling nights of winter, then applied the poultice, flinching in empathy as a line deepened between her brows. The fever threatened next. He mounted a tireless watch, dabbing the cloth dampened with cool water against her brow, her pulse points, her throat. He coaxed minute sips of water between her lips, pleading with her to swallow even when consciousness seemed a distant shore. The hours blurred, marked only by the dance of firelight on the rough-hewn walls and the fragile rhythm of her breathing. He hadn't felt this vital in what felt like an eternity. Not since. He cut off the memory's tendrils before they could fully bloom. Martha. The ache, usually a dull throb, flared with unexpected intensity. He banished it, anchoring himself to the woman before him. She wasn't Martha. This was a stranger, a casualty desperately in need of his aid. As the fire waned, painting the cabin in elongated shadows, Jebediah sank back into his time-worn armchair, his gaze riveted to her face. He detected a raw vulnerability mirroring his own, a profound yearning for sanctuary and belonging. He, of all people, understood that desolate craving. He recalled his own history, the motivations that had driven him to seek refuge in this isolated haven. He'd come to outrun the past, to bury it deep. But now, this woman, Lily Rivers or Clara May Beaumont, depending on which version held true, had trespassed into his carefully guarded solitude, compelling him to confront the very demons he sought to suppress. He fed the fire, coaxing the flames to life. They greedily consumed the dry wood, bathing the cabin in a soft, embracing light. He would shelter her, he resolved. He would guide her back to health, and he would aid her in unraveling the truth of her ordeal, even if that truth threatened to dismantle the hard-won peace he'd finally discovered. Because, gazing at her, he understood he couldn't simply stand idly by and allow her to suffer. He was beholden to her at the very least, and perhaps, just perhaps, he owed it to himself too. He drew his chair closer to the cot, his old hound dog, Blue, resting his heavy head on Jeb's knee. He waited, observing, listening, a silent sentinel bathed in the flickering glow. He'd stand guard, ensuring her safety, at least for tonight's duration. Awakening and revelation. A soft groan escaped Clara's lips as consciousness returned. Sunlight, filtered unevenly through the dusty panes of Jebediah's window, striped her face with light and shadow. Her eyelids, heavy with sleep, or something more, parted to reveal storm-gray eyes, confused and disoriented. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice parched. Jebediah, seated by the window, carving absent-mindedly at a piece of wood, rose with a deliberate slowness. He offered her a cup of water, the metal surprisingly cool against her unsteady hands. "You're safe, inside my cabin." She drank greedily, a thin stream trickling from the corner of her mouth. She coughed, her gaze then fixed on him, questioning. "And you are?" "Jebediah Stone." His tone remained even, his expression unreadable. Experience had taught him the value of measured replies. Clara attempted to sit up, a sharp intake of breath betraying the effort. "Lily." "I'm Lily," she murmured, the name sounding fragile, almost unfamiliar. He observed her silently, allowing her to gather herself. The cabin, compact and sparsely appointed, offered a Spartan comfort, yet provided shelter from the elements. The combined aroma of pine and wood smoke filled the space, a stark contrast to whatever horrors she had fled. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the rough-hewn logs, the well-worn quilt draped across the bed, the rifle standing sentinel beside the hearth. My memory is fractured." Jebediah offered no prompting, his gaze unwavering. He knew the value of patience. Memories, like frightened birds, needed gentle coaxing. After a protracted silence, she spoke, her voice nearly inaudible. "I came here to meet someone." A flash of anguish crossed her features, her fingers tightening on the blanket. He recognized that look, the hollow ache of shattered hope. "A husband," she finally admitted, the word dripping with a bitter self-awareness. I was a mail-order bride." The confession hung in the air, laden with unspoken narratives. A forgotten empathy stirred within Jebediah, a protective urge he had long suppressed. She glanced at her hands, roughened and worn, betraying her false identity. He was supposed to be waiting. At the stage stop. He never appeared. Her voice faltered, cracking slightly. "I waited for days. Eventually, I walked, hoping to find another town, another life." Her eyes sought his, pleading for understanding. "He stole my money, everything. I'm a stranger here." The weight of her circumstances settled upon Jebediah. He recognized the desperation barely concealed beneath her fragile facade. He had spent years fortifying his heart, yet her story was steadily eroding his defenses, exposing long-dormant vulnerabilities. "You can stay here," he offered, his voice rougher than he intended, "until you get your bearings." A spark of hope momentarily illuminated her eyes, quickly extinguished by a wave of apprehension. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," he countered, his tone softening imperceptibly. He recognized a reflection of his own isolation in her gaze, a shared understanding of the outsider's burden. He knew the path ahead would be arduous, yet he couldn't abandon her. Not after witnessing the undisguised anguish etched upon her face. He would extend his aid regardless of the personal cost. "My name isn't Lily," she confessed in a tremulous whisper. "It's Clara. Clara May Beaumont." Sparks of affection. The days that followed bled into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Clara, who now insisted on being called Lily, her middle name, moved with a newfound strength. The fever had broken, leaving her pale but resolute. Jebediah watched her, a silent observer, as she explored the cabin, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the furniture, her eyes lingering on the pelts that lined the walls. One afternoon, while Jebediah was sharpening his axe, Lily sat by the window mending a tear in one of her dresses. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but Jebediah felt a need to break it. "You ever sew before?" he asked, the words rough around the edges. Lily looked up, a small smile gracing her lips. "My mother taught me. Said a woman should always know how to mend her own clothes." She paused, her smile fading slightly. "She taught me a lot of things." "Mothers usually do," Jebediah said, returning to his task. He hesitated, then added, "Mine taught me how to track. And how to be alone." The last part hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lily's gaze softened. "Being alone isn't always a choice, is it?" Jebediah grunted, noncommittal. He didn't want to talk about his past, the reasons he had sought the solitude. But Lily's eyes held a knowing that disarmed him. "Lost my family to cholera," he said, the words clipped and devoid of emotion. "Didn't see the point in replacing them." Lily's needle stilled. "I'm sorry, Jebediah. That's a terrible loss." He shrugged, the gesture dismissive. "It was a long time ago." He changed the subject, eager to avoid the mire of his own grief. "What about you, Lily? Where did you learn to mend so well?" She hesitated, her eyes clouding over. "I grew up in Philadelphia. My father was a clockmaker. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Until—" She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. "Until he died. Then everything changed." She told him about the poverty that followed, the desperation that led her to answer the advertisement for a mail-order bride. She didn't reveal her true name or the circumstances surrounding her abandonment, only that she had been betrayed and left with nothing. As she spoke, Jebediah listened, his heart clenching with a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He saw the vulnerability beneath her resilient facade, the fear that still lingered in her eyes. He found himself drawn to her quiet strength, her determination to rebuild her life. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit by the fire, Jebediah whittling wood, Lily reading aloud from the few books he possessed. Their voices mingled in the quiet cabin, a gentle harmony that chased away the shadows of loneliness. Sometimes their hands would brush as they reached for the same book, a spark of awareness passing between them. One night, Lily was reading a poem about love and loss. When she finished, she looked up at Jebediah, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. "Do you believe in love, Jebediah?" she asked softly. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. "I believe in loyalty," he said finally. "And in doing what's right." "But what about love?" she pressed, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing the curve of her cheek, the way the firelight danced in her eyes. He saw a woman who had been hurt, betrayed, yet still dared to hope. And in that moment, he knew that something was changing within him. "Maybe," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "maybe I'm starting to." The air crackled with unspoken tension. Lily's gaze held his, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other, the silence filled with 1,000 unspoken words. The crackling fire was the only sound in the small cabin. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, a rustic perfume that spoke of hearth and home. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "Thank you, Jebediah," she said softly. "For everything." He nodded, unable to speak, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that his life would never be the same. Learning and growing. The rifle felt heavy in Clara's hands, cold steel against her trembling fingers. Jebediah stood beside her, a silent sentinel, his presence a comforting weight against the vastness of the wilderness. He cleaned and oiled the weapon, then patiently showed her how to load it, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe. Now it was her turn. "Relax your shoulders, Lily," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Tense muscles make for a shaky aim." She tried, but anxiety coiled tight within her. The target, a crudely drawn circle on a weathered plank of wood, seemed miles away. "What if I miss?" "Then you try again," he replied simply. "Survival ain't about perfect shots. It's about persistence." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a jarring explosion that sent a flock of birds scattering from the nearby trees. The bullet whizzed past the target, kicking up dirt several feet to the left. Jebediah didn't comment on her aim. Instead, he reloaded the rifle, handing it back to her. "Adjust your stance. Use your whole body to absorb the recoil." They practiced for hours until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but with each shot, her aim improved. By the end of the day, she was hitting the target more often than she missed. Later, back at the cabin, Clara, or rather Lily, decided to tackle another kind of wilderness, the interior of Jebediah's home. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminating the stark simplicity of the room. The air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and something indefinably Jebediah. He watched her, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, as she swept the floor, humming a tuneless melody. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, the simple, domestic music of a woman making a home. He felt a stirring within him, a warmth that spread through his chest, chasing away the familiar chill of loneliness. She'd found a small, cracked vase tucked away in a cupboard and filled it with wildflowers she'd picked near the creek. The splash of color brightened the room, softening the rough edges of the cabin. She even coaxed him into hanging a woven blanket she'd found folded in a trunk, adding a touch of warmth to the bare walls. "It's nice," he admitted, his voice gruff. Lily smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "It just needs a woman's touch, Jeb." The next morning, he showed her how to set snares for rabbits, how to identify edible plants, how to track deer. She was a quick learner, absorbing his knowledge with a quiet intensity. He found himself enjoying her company, the comfortable silence that settled between them as they worked side by side. One afternoon, they were cleaning fish by the creek when Lily spoke, her voice soft. "Thank you, Jebediah." He looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," she said, meeting his gaze. "For saving me, for teaching me, for making me feel safe." He looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You earned it. You're strong, Lily. Stronger than you think." She laughed, a light, airy sound. "I'm not sure about that, but I'm trying." She paused, then added, "I'm also trying to be worthy of your trust, Jeb. I know I haven't been completely honest with you." He waited, his expression unreadable. "There are things in my past, things I'm not proud of, things that might put you in danger." He stood and tossed the fish guts into the creek. "Everyone's got a past, Lily. It's the present that matters. And right now you're here." But he knew deep down that her past wouldn't stay buried forever. It was only a matter of time before it came knocking at their door. And when it did, he would be ready. The wanted poster. The wind shrieked, a feral thing battering the cabin. Jebediah, back from the hunt's chilly grasp, shoved his rabbit bounty through the doorway, fighting the gale that threatened to snatch them away. He slammed the portal shut, a cold prickle tracing his spine that transcended the mountain chill. "Lily," he called, his voice roughened by the tempest. She emerged from the cook space, a dusting of flour upon her apron. "Home already?" "The stew's not quite ready yet." "Doesn't matter." He deposited the rabbits on the crude tabletop. As he did, something snagged his attention. A tattered paper, pasted to the door by the elements, ripped free and fluttered earthward. Recognition struck him like a blow, a wanted flyer. Such notices were uncommon in these remote parts. The law generally conceded the peaks to those capable of enduring them. He retrieved it, a knot forming in his stomach. The paper felt coarse and aged, the ink blurred by weather and time. Yet the portrait remained stark. It depicted a man with sharp, predatory features, a thick mustache, and a gaze that bored into the viewer. Underneath, in stark, uncompromising print, "Wanted. Dead or alive. Black Bart." The name was a whispered legend in saloons and around flickering campfires, a story of unmatched ruthlessness. The scourge of the Western Territories. Jebediah had never encountered the man, but he knew the grim chronicles, stage holdups, bank robberies, and a wake of the dead. He flipped the poster, seeking details, any clue. A reward, it's some astounding, was declared. His eyes then locked on a small, time-worn photograph affixed to the lower corner. A formal studio portrait, the subject younger, clean-shaven, yet those eyes. Undeniable. A deeper shiver wormed through him, outstripping the cold outside. He recalled the picture Lily treasured, the one she guarded so fiercely, the one about which she never spoke. He remembered the man in that image, the one she claimed as her brother. He moved to the small shelf where Lily kept her few precious things. His fingers, clumsy from the cold, grappled with the worn leather of her valise. He hesitated, a coil of shame tightening his chest. He'd never pried, never breached such personal boundaries. But this felt crucial. It felt like self-preservation. He opened the valise. A familiar whiff of lavender mixed with something else, something acrid and metallic, assaulted his nostrils. Tucked beneath a carefully folded shawl, he found the photograph. He lifted it, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The man in Lily's photo was younger, more naive in appearance, yet the connection to the younger Black Bart on the wanted poster was stark. The cut of his jaw, the architecture of his nose, the glimmer of light in his eyes, impossible to deny. He lowered the image, his thoughts reeling. Could it be mere chance? Could she be deceived? Or was Lily concealing a secret more perilous than he could ever fathom? He heard Lily humming quietly as she tended the simmering stew. He slid the picture back into the valise, his movements precise, masking the chaos within. He closed the valise and returned it to the shelf. Turning to her, his face was a study in neutrality. The warmth of the fire, the inviting scent of the stew, the humdrum piece of their life, it all seemed like a delicate facade, a gossamer veil over a precipice of unspoken truths. Lily, he began, his tone measured, look at this. He presented the ragged wanted poster. She approached warily, a crease forming between her brows. As her gaze landed on the flyer, all color fled from her countenance. She swayed, reaching for the table to steady herself. Lily? Jebediah repeated, his voice laden with a question he dreaded hearing answered. She remained mute, utterly speechless. Her eyes, wide with raw terror, darted between the poster and Jebediah's gaze. Only the wind's piercing cry could be heard beyond the log walls, a lament that mirrored the storm raging inside the tiny cabin. The stew bubbled untended on the stove. The rabbits lay neglected on the table. And the fragile trust between Jebediah and Lily teetered on the brink. Confrontation and confession. The air in the cabin hung still and heavy, a suffocating blanket of unspoken words. On the roughly hewn table, Jebediah had placed the broadside, Black Bart's cruel visage glaring up, a silent accusation. Clara, Lily? Remained frozen, color leached from her face, leaving it ashen. This requires explanation, Jebediah stated, his tone leveled, the usual warmth absent. The clipped sentence echoed, thick with distrust. She avoided his gaze, her attention riveted on the outlaw's likeness, a specter from waking nightmares. Her hands, usually deft and nimble in the kitchen, now trembled uncontrollably. I can't explain, she breathed, the whisper almost swallowed by the oppressive quiet. He nudged the paper closer. That man. You recognize him, don't you? Your brother, as the poster suggests. Tears began their glistening ascent, distorting the already blurred features of the desperado. His name is Bartholomew. Bart, yes. Bart, Jebediah echoed, the syllable like grit on his tongue. Black Bart, wanted for a litany of crimes. What's your connection? He gripped the table's edge, his knuckles bone white. He had to know, was the woman who had begun to claim his affections bound inextricably to a man who embodied everything he loathed? She winced at the sharpness in his voice, finally meeting his gaze, her eyes mirroring a desperate entreaty. He is my fiancé. The declaration struck Jebediah like an unforeseen blow. He staggered back as if slapped. Fiancé? You were to wed him. I was meant to, she gasped, hot tears tracing paths down her cheeks. But I couldn't. I simply could not. He observed her, his thoughts a whirlwind. He recalled the constant apprehension in her eyes upon arrival, the flinching at sudden sounds. He had attributed it to the rigors of travel, the loss of her kin. Now, the origin of her dread became clear. Why? Why flee instead of leaving? She shook her head, voice fracturing. You don't understand. Bart, he doesn't release what he takes. He dictates everything. Everyone. I was ensnared. He designated me. I had no volition. She clutched herself as if bracing for a strike. He's a monster, Jebediah. A remorseless, vicious brute. The palpable terror in her voice, the genuine fear carved into her features, eroded his anger. He perceived not an accomplice, but a terrified woman trying to escape an inferno. Even so, doubts persisted. So you fled. You answered an ad for a wife and hoped he wouldn't find you. She nodded, eyes glued to the floorboards. I adopted a new name. I prayed he wouldn't pursue me. I only craved a fresh existence, a chance to be unfettered. And you neglected to mention this? That you were evading one of the territory's most ruthless outlaws. His tone, though tempered, retained a sharp edge of suspicion. She raised her gaze, pleading for understanding. I was petrified. I feared your rejection if you knew. I feared his discovery. I yearned for a place to call home. She reached out, her hand hovering hesitantly between them. Please, Jebediah. Believe me. I never intended to harm anyone. I only wanted sanctuary. He scrutinized her, his heart a battleground between suspicion and a growing, undeniable compassion. The truth resonated from her face, in the quiver of her voice, in the haunted depths of her eyes. She was running, not from justice, but from a man who held her captive in a different kind of prison. He recognized the fear, yet also the ember of hope that had drawn him to her initially. He desired to believe her. He desperately needed to believe her. But Black Bart was a dangerous man, and should he seek his runaway bride, their quiet existence in the mountains would be irrevocably destroyed. The outlaw's arrival. A subtle tremor resonated through the ground, barely audible. Jebediah, feeding the evening fire, froze, his hand suspended above the stack of logs. His axe, a familiar weight against his palm, remained still. Not thunder, this was an intentional quaking, a deep, percussive rhythm suggestive of numerous approaching horses. Inside, Clara, humming a tuneless melody as she repaired a rip in Jebediah's shirt, seemed oblivious. He didn't alert her. Instead, with practiced stealth, he laid down the axe and retrieved his rifle from its resting place over the hearth. He scanned the gloaming landscape through the window. The pines stood like stoic guardians, their boughs stirring in the soft breeze. But past them, dust boiled on the skyline, an unnatural, hurtling cloud. Then he saw them, a tattered line of riders spilling over the ridge a quarter-mile distant. Even at that remove, the flash of steel was unmistakable. And their leader, astride a towering obsidian stallion, silhouetted against the fading sun, radiated palpable menace. Drawn by his stillness, Clara appeared at his side. "What is it?" she breathed. Jebediah's gaze remained fixed on the riders. "Trouble," he rasped, his voice low and rough. "The kind we knew was coming." As they closed the distance, their features sharpened. Harsh visages, etched by weather and hardship, cloaked in bandanas and shaded by broad-brimmed hats. Each gripped a rifle casually, yet with readiness. And leading them all, Black Bart. His dark hair was plastered back, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He looked like a predator who had at last cornered its quarry. They encircled the cabin, a crescent of menace cutting off retreat. Bart hauled his stallion to a stop, the beast stomping impatiently. His gaze swept over the humble dwelling, lingering on the window where Jebediah stood. "Clara!" Bart's voice echoed across the clearing, coated in a chilling sweetness. "Come out, darlin'. Don't make this difficult on yourself." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jebediah felt the tremor that ran through her. He squeezed her shoulder, his grip solid. "She ain't here," Jebediah retorted, his voice even but edged with steel. Bart chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Don't insult me, old man. I know she's inside. And I know about the purloined funds. Hand her over, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live to see another sunrise." Jebediah spat, the gesture a punctuation mark of defiance. "This is my land. You ain't welcome. About face and ride out and I might let you draw breath." Bart's smile evaporated, replaced by a frigid glare. "You've chosen your path," he purred, his voice laced with venom. "Tear the place apart, boys. Find her. And the loot." The riders dismounted, moving with grim purpose. They fanned out, constricting the cabin, rifles raised and ready. The sun vanished below the horizon, draping the clearing in deepening shadow. Jebediah double-checked the load in his rifle. His ammunition was limited, but his aim was true. He stole a glance at Clara, fear blanching her face, yet defiance smoldering in her eyes. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice unbreakable. "Whatever happens." He reached for the door, his hand gripping the latch. The air thrummed with impending violence. The outlaw was here, and Jebediah was set. Under siege. The initial shot, a piercing screech that shattered the fragile quiet, chewed a groove in the wood just above Jebediah's head. Instinct flared. He slammed Clara down behind the overturned table, a barricade reinforced only that morning. "Stay put," he rumbled, already lining up the sights on his rifle. The air stung with the bitter tang of burned powder as a swarm of angry hornets, bullets, tore at the cabin's defenses, puffing out dust and showering them with splinters. Jebediah answered, each shot measured, meant to cripple, not kill. Murder wasn't in his nature, but he'd defend his hearth, his woman, until his last breath rattled in his chest. Clara, despite the tremor in her limbs, discovered a strange core of resolve. This was the day of reckoning she had dreaded, yet she wasn't facing it alone. Jebediah stood as her bulwark, a figure carved from granite and fueled by raw courage. No more cowering. She fumbled for the shotgun he'd taught her to wield, the chilled steel a strangely reassuring weight in her trembling grasp. "Can you use that thing?" Jebediah roared over the escalating clamor, his rifle bark spitting lead that forced one of Bart's thugs to ground. "I'll damn well try," she shouted back, her voice firm despite the frantic drumbeat in her chest. Peeking over the makeshift cover, her heart hammered against her ribs. A lean, weasel-faced outlaw was trying to outflank them. She leveled the shotgun, aimed for center mass, and squeezed. The explosion was concussive. Recoil bucked against her shoulder, threatening to dislodge her. The weasel-faced man howled, clutching his leg as he crumpled. "Atta girl," Jebediah muttered, already reloading with fluid precision. "Keep him pinned." Dusty, sensing the lethal atmosphere, had abandoned his fireside post. A brown streak of fur and snapping fangs, he harried the attackers, nipping at their heels, disrupting their aim with frustrated oaths. One of them swung a rifle butt at the dog, but Dusty was too quick, evading the blow and latching onto the man's pant leg. Black Bart, observing the escalating disarray, spat a curse. "Get rid of that mutt," he bellowed. "Someone around back, now." Two men peeled away from the main assault and began to encircle the cabin. Jebediah spotted them and swore under his breath. He couldn't be in two places at once. "Clara, guard the front," he yelled, snatching his revolver. "I'm heading out back." "Jebediah, don't." "It's suicide," she cried, but he was already gone, swallowed by the shadows beyond the back door. Now she was alone, the shotgun clutched so tight her fingers ached. She was no fragile flower. She was forged of sterner stuff. Edging up to peer over the tabletop, her gaze swept the yard, locking onto the hate-twisted faces of the remaining outlaws as they advanced. Drawing a deep breath, she steadied her grip, found her mark, and unleashed hell. A sacrifice of love. Jebediah circled wide, the quiet forest yielding softly beneath his tread. He tracked Bart's men by their shouts, ragged with mounting irritation. Dusty's frantic yelps echoed, homing him in. He distinguished Bart, a stark figure against the fading light, spitting orders. Leveling his rifle, Jebediah squeezed the trigger. A raw scream tore through the dusk as Bart staggered, hand clamped to his bleeding shoulder. He bellowed, a sound laced with agony and wrath. "Stone! You son of a bitch!" Slipping back into the undergrowth, Jebediah offered no retort. He needed to stay elusive, keep them off balance. But as he fed another cartridge into the chamber, one of Bart's cohorts materialized, his advance surprisingly swift. The man-dove slamming Jebediah to the leaf-strewn earth. His rifle spun away, lost in the dry foliage. They wrestled, a flurry of limbs and desperate gasps. Though at a disadvantage in size, Jebediah battled with the ferocity of a trapped wolf. His fists connected, a sharp crack signaling broken bone. The man groaned, his attack faltering. Jebediah scrambled up, eyes searching for his weapon, only to find Bart looming, a pistol trained on his heart. "Curtain call, Stone," Bart snarled, face contorted with loathing. "Should have minded your own business." Jebediah stared down the barrel, jaw rigid. He'd made his choice, shielding Clara. A pang of regret, sharp and icy, speared him. He would never voice his feelings. "Any last words?" Bart spat, his finger tightening. "Rot in hell, Bart," Jebediah rasped, gaze unwavering. Bart's laugh was a harsh, grating sound. "With pleasure. After you." The hammer clicked. A swift, unexpected movement. A shriek. Clara. She'd thrown herself in the line of fire, back a shield, arms outstretched. The gunshot exploded, a thunderclap in the stillness. Clara shuddered violently as the bullet ripped through her. She slumped to the ground, eyes wide with shock and torment. "Clara!" Jebediah's cry was a primal roar of despair. He knelt beside her, cradling her close. Her blood bloomed on his hands, hot and slick. Bart stared, his features a frozen tableau of horror. "Clara? What? Why Clara?" Jebediah choked, tears blurring his vision. Her gaze flickered, finding his. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Couldn't let him hurt you, Jeb." The words were a breath, barely audible. "You gave me a haven." A searing, glacial rage consumed Jebediah. He gently lowered Clara to the ground, hands trembling uncontrollably. He rose to face Bart, his eyes burning with a ferocity he never knew existed. The world contracted, focusing entirely on the man who dared defile what was his. Bart, who'd stolen the fragile sense of peace he'd finally discovered. Bart recoiled, a flicker of dread now visible in his eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Jebediah remained silent. He moved with unexpected speed, a predator closing in on its quarry. The man who had tackled him attempted to intervene, but Jebediah swatted him aside with a savage backhand, sending him sprawling. He stood before Bart, fists clenched tight. "You'll answer for this, Bart," he stated, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "You'll answer with your life." Justice served. The air crackled, not with gunfire, but with a raw, primal energy. Bart stood frozen. The echo of Clara's words, "Take me, not him," still ringing in his ears. The cunning glint was gone, replaced by something akin to disbelief, then a flicker of something Jebediah couldn't quite decipher. Disappointment? Betrayal? It didn't matter. All that mattered was the opening. Jebediah moved like a striking serpent. He launched himself forward, the momentum of his rage a tangible force. Bart, still reeling, raised his pistol, but Jebediah was already on him. A brutal swipe knocked the weapon aside, sending it skittering across the dusty ground. He gripped Bart's throat, his calloused fingers digging into the outlaw's windpipe. "She chose me," Jebediah rasped, each word a guttural growl. His thumbs pressed harder, cutting off Bart's air supply. The outlaw clawed at Jebediah's arms, his face contorting, turning a mottled purple. Fear, raw and untamed, finally filled his eyes. The other men, momentarily paralyzed by the swiftness of Jebediah's attack and their leader's vulnerability, started to stir. One, a wiry man with a scarred cheek, fumbled for his rifle. Another, younger and clearly less hardened, simply stared, his mouth agape. "Don't just stand there," Bart choked, his voice a strangled whisper. But the will to fight had evaporated. They saw the cold, implacable fury in Jebediah's eyes, the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from him. Bart, their feared leader, was being choked to death, and they knew with chilling certainty that they were next. The wiry man dropped his rifle, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. He turned and ran, disappearing into the scrub brush. The younger one followed, stumbling over the uneven ground. Within seconds, Bart and Jebediah were alone. The only sounds were Bart's desperate gasps and the frantic thumping of his heart. Jebediah felt a savage satisfaction as the outlaw's struggles weakened. He could end it here, right now. A life for a life. An eye for an eye. But something stayed his hand. It wasn't mercy. It was something colder, something more deliberate. He loosened his grip just enough for Bart to gulp in a ragged breath. "You won't die easy," Jebediah hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You'll live with what you did. You'll live knowing she chose death over you." He shoved Bart away, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The outlaw lay there, coughing and gasping, his eyes wide with terror. Jebediah stood over him, a towering figure of retribution. "Get out," Jebediah said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Get out and never come back." Bart didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of his men. Finding none, he turned and fled, disappearing into the same scrub brush that had swallowed his followers. Jebediah watched him go, then slowly turned back toward the wagon. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows across the clearing, painting the scene in hues of blood orange and deep purple. He walked toward Clara, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. She was still unconscious, her face pale, but she was breathing. A shallow, ragged breath, but a breath nonetheless. He knelt beside her, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. He felt for a pulse, a faint, fluttery rhythm beneath her skin. She was alive. Barely, but alive. He carefully lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. He would get her back to the cabin, tend to her wounds, and nurse her back to health. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he would protect her with his life. A new horizon. Clara drifted back to awareness in increments, each breath a shallow, painful reminder of Bart's treachery. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the cabin walls, painting dust motes dancing in the air. Jebediah sat beside her, his large hand enveloping hers. His gaze, usually so guarded, was open, filled with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. How she rasped, her voice thick with disuse. "Easy," Jebediah said, his voice a low rumble. "You took a bad hit. You rest now." He gently pressed a cool, damp cloth to her forehead. The scent of chamomile filled the air, a familiar comfort from the tea he had brewed. Days bled into one another. Clara slept, woke, drank the bitter tea Jebediah offered, and drifted back to sleep. He tended to her wound with a gentleness that belied his size, changing the bandages and applying a poultice of herbs he'd gathered from the surrounding hills. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant reassurance, a silent promise of protection. As her strength returned, so did the memories. Bart's cruel words, the sting of the blade, Jebediah's fierce defense. Shame washed over her, followed by a profound sense of gratitude. She had brought this danger to his doorstep, yet he had risked everything for her. "Jebediah," she said one morning, her voice stronger now. "I'm so sorry." He stilled, his callous thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "For what, Clara?" "For all of it. For lying, for bringing Bart here, for—" He cut her off, his gaze firm. "You did what you had to do to survive. That's all that matters." When she was strong enough to sit up, Jebediah helped her outside. The fresh air filled her lungs, and the sight of the mountains bathed in the golden light of late afternoon brought tears to her eyes. Life, she realized, was a precious gift, one she had almost lost. "I need to tell them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About Bart." Jebediah nodded. "It's time." The ride to town was slow and arduous. Clara sat behind Jebediah on his horse, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. The familiar scent of leather and horse sweat filled her nostrils, a strange comfort in the face of her apprehension. The sheriff's office was small and dusty, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a weary face, listened intently as Jebediah recounted the events of the past few weeks, his voice steady and unwavering. Clara corroborated his story, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of Bart's crimes and her own desperate escape. When they finished, Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Black Bart, huh? We've been looking for him for a long time." He looked at Clara, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, miss. You're free now." Jebediah handed over Bart's gun belt and the meager belongings he had carried. "He's out at my place, bound and waiting." Sheriff Brody's eyes widened. "You captured him?" Jebediah simply nodded. The next morning, Jebediah and Clara stood on the crest of a hill overlooking his land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "They'll hang him," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "He earned it," Jebediah replied, his voice devoid of emotion. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. "What now?" Clara asked, turning to face him. Jebediah took her hand in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Now," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "we build a life." He looked out at the horizon. "Together." Clara squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a love she never thought possible. The fear and uncertainty of the past still lingered, but they were overshadowed by a newfound hope, a quiet confidence that together they could face whatever the future held. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. They stood there, hand in hand, two solitary souls who had found solace and strength in each other's arms, ready to face the unknown together.